Welcome back to The Baby in the Crib. This will be the fourth clip that I'm recording. Um, I haven't done anything in about a month or so, but during that time, I've been doing research on something that I was drawn in the direction, and I started to research it, and I made a connection to Marguerite Junge. To the people that we were investigating, researching on, that we thought in the beginning had something to do maybe with the kidnapping. Um, as it stands right now, I've linked her in a family tree to the family that we were researching. So that's a good development. Also, in the very beginning of our research, the first thing that I wanted to do was to look into the people that lived in my home, previous owners. Um, from literature that was handed out in the neighborhood tour last year, my home was listed as being built in the late 1800s. I know when we lived there in the 70s, when I was there in the 70s, the house was over 100 years old already. Um, and the literature was handed out, and it told a little bit about the property. It's now a historical house. That whole row of houses. There's quite a few in that area that are. But what I wanted to do was to look to see who lived there before. Okay, the very first people that I could find were a family named Power. Okay, they lived there, and they occupied not only our home, but the one next to it. So they had two houses. Um, there's six in that row, and they own the first two. Um, they were there for from 1900 up to 1920, so they lived there for 20 years. The first 10 years, it shows that they occupied both sides. In 1920, it looks then like they were just on the one side that we lived in, and rented out the other side. In 1920, I took notice that on the other side, there was a doctor that lived in that building. And when I first started to do the research, that kind of caught my eye because when the kidnapping first happened, that child was supposedly sick. And I thought, well, if they brought the child to the house, there was a doctor that lived right in the building. But of course, in the very beginning, kind of grasping at straws there. There was nothing, that told me that, yeah, that would be the reason why they would bring the baby there. But talking to my dad insists that that doctor had his office in our house, but the records show that he was next door. Um, he wound up staying there in 1920. It looks like he rented, but then he must have bought the house after that. I'm not sure if the same woman owned both of them and sold it to him, but he lived there until the 1940s, so he was there a long time. Well, the thing, that I thought of, and in the very beginning, this one family occupied both houses. Now, it was a husband and wife. They had, I believe it was about 8 or 9 children. It was a large family. They had a servant that lived with them. In fact, I think in the very beginning they had two. Then there was a time that it looked like her sister and brother-in-law lived with her also. Um, Now, when I lived there, that building that we were in had 4 apartments. So to own two of them, you had a total of 8 apartments. That's a lot of room. But my thinking is, if she owned both and they occupied both, which they did, they showed at being at both numbers, occupying by both numbers, I would seem to think that there was a way to get in and out of the houses another way than coming out the front door, down all the steps and having to go up there had to be an opening that combined the two homes together so they could use it as one. That's just, I have no proof of that. Um, I really don't remember when I was a kid if there was a doorway. There was no doorway that lead into the next building. We didn't own the building next door, but at that time there might have been, where there was a connection between the two without going outside. And like I said, the doctor lived there, so I thought, okay, if they were to have brought the child there, the doctor would have been there, even though he lived next door. If they needed him, he was right there. But that was just something that I was just thinking as a possibility. I researched him further, and he was a doctor. He's a throat doctor. It looks like he came from a family of doctors. His father was a doctor, and there was other uncles, relatives that were MDs of, different types. But that's where the research ended on him, Um, And then, I looked for other people, like for the following years. The census go every 10 years. So I checked all the census to see who lived in that house through the years. In the 30s, in 1930, for the census for 1930, there was a police officer that lived there. It was owned by a different person by the 30s. It seems to me from the records that through the years, the woman that owned the two, she then just owned the one. Um, it showed that she was a widow, so her husband had passed away. Obviously, became difficult maybe to afford to live there. She couldn't keep the property. She shows as living in the neighborhood, but she moved out of that location. So 1930 was a new owner. He worked for the railroad, and he had rented the other floors. But unfortunately, on the census, you can't tell who lived on what floor. I know that our apartment at the top had 2 bedrooms. It was the largest apartment of the 4 floors. Now, the police officer that lived in that apartment, he had 3 boys. You could guess that maybe he lived on the top floor in my apartment, the exact apartment that we lived in, because he had more children. His rent was a little higher than the others, so that could have been, but there's no proof as to him actually being in that apartment. But he did work for the city as a police officer. There was another family that lived in there. I believe he was a grocer. So, I mean, that didn't tell me much by seeing who lived there. I just wanted to see actually if my family lived in that house. From what I know, my grandmother bought that house in the late 40s. My mother and father were married in 1947, I believe. 47, 48. They were already living there. My grandmother already owned the house at that time when they were married. So it was the late 40s. And then my father, my grandmother sold the house to my father, and she moved next door, but not in the same buildings. There was a house to the opposite side. If you're looking at the apartment buildings, her house was to the left. It was a freestanding home. That was a 3-family house too. She bought that and she moved there, and she lived there for many years. looking at the census really, it told me who lived there, but it really didn't give me any, But for the first year, in fact, this is April, and this marks 3 years doing the research. We started in early April. It's 3 years already. But what I was going to say is that the first full year of the researching, I mean, it involved a lot of reading. Um, Reading things that, you put it in the back of your head. And it wasn't until at least a year, even longer, that the more you read, then little connections were starting to pop up. Names were starting to sound familiar. Maybe an incident sounded familiar, and then I'd have to go back and try to remember where I seen that name, or So it wasn't until a good year that connections were made. Now it's 3 years, and the doctor that lived in that house actually is related to the people that we were researching in connection with this incident. Um, the research that we've done, most of it was done through the census, through family trees. Family trees will tell you a lot. Um, you know, all the people that we're researching have been dead for years. If they're not dead, they're well in their 90s. So, it's very difficult to find out any information on these people other than written documents. Um, so I relied on the census a lot to see where people were living, who they were living with, who was in their neighborhood. Um, but that came well after a year or so, because I couldn't do it in the beginning. It wasn't until then, after reading so many names, and then you make the connection. Um, in the very beginning of our research, um, it was very difficult because I really didn't know what I was looking for, where to start, where to begin. And even times when I would think to myself, well, maybe I'm just not on the right path. But then I would think, it would bring me back to the dream. And here's a really good reason why I dreamt that dream, and why it was where it was. And I'm convinced that that child was in that room. Um, so, you know, everything that I could find to read on the politics of Jersey City. I mean, let's face it, we know that this event, the kidnapping, was politically motivated. Um, they felt that way right from the very beginning. The best thing to do is, being that the dream happened in Jersey City, I need to learn about the politics in Jersey City. Um, it was a little worrisome to me in the very beginning because I had two uncles that worked for the mayor. And I just kept hoping through my research that it didn't prove that not my whole family, but any members in my family could have been involved in such a thing. Do I know that for sure today? No, I don't. But I just hope that they really weren't. I don't find any evidence that they were. The only thing that I know is that two of my mother's uncles worked for the mayor. The one, Daniel, they were Daniel and Anthony Luzzi. Daniel worked for the mayor in his office. From what I can see, his job, he had that job well before Mayor Hague became mayor. He worked in City Hall, exactly. He was listed as a elevator operator. And maybe in the very beginning, that's exactly what his job was. Through the years, and once the mayor got in there, I'm sure they were friends. They knew of each other before Hague became mayor, um, he worked, working there. I'm sure he's seen him, and they became friends, and he wound up working in his office. I don't know if he was like a private secretary, exactly what he did, I don't know. He was still listed as elevator operator um, as late as 1930, but I don't believe that was really his job. His brother, though, he didn't work inside City Hall. He had various jobs. From what we know, he worked for the county, he worked for the city. He had two jobs. Um, Usually, when you held two positions like that in the city, especially Jersey City, um, that was a way of awarding you for something. I'm not saying that he did anything bad, but obviously he worked close with the mayor, or the mayor was happy with his work. He was able to have both jobs. Um, According to my dad, his main job was to go to apartment buildings and check their boilers, inspect the boilers, and make sure that everything was working well. But I really don't buy that, because anytime that I did see him, he was always dressed up in a suit, hat, his pinky ring, not dressed the way you would be if you were inspecting boilers. It just, I know that he did a lot of work when um, the election day came around. He was the one. I mean, they canvassed like crazy. I mean, they had to. If they didn't do it, they would have lost their jobs for the mayor, to go to door. Sick and dying people, they would practically carry them to the polls so they could vote, it's a well-known thing that when Hague was in office in Jersey City, he was always accused of voter fraud. Um, they could never prosecute him. He was too well connected. He would have never been prosecuted. He was a man that should have spent many years in jail for the things that he did, but he walked away from it all. He was able to stay out of trouble because he was so well connected with everybody. Um, but we'll get to that. So yeah, so they both work for the city, and starting my research, I thought, okay, well, I have my two uncles that work for the mayor. I know in one of my last clips I mentioned that the thing that directed me to actually caught my attention reading clips on the internet was the fact that a main suspect in that case was named Enrico Girardi. And Girardi is my grandmother, my father's mother's maiden name. So that got a little scary. I thought maybe this is Uncle Enrico that I never met, or the family never talked about. I did a family tree, and I don't see Enrico fitting in there, but the name was what caught my eye from the very beginning. But the funny thing is, my grandmother, they all came from Italy. Not all at one time, but there were so many in this neighborhood. In our neighborhood, it was filled with what they call paisans from the other side. There was family after family that came here. A lot of them came as single people, and then they would marry when they got here and have families. And back then they had big families. So if the years went by, there was an awful lot of people, in our family that lived there. But the funny thing is that before my grandmother had came here, when she lived in Italy, she was very good friends with my mother's family. My mother's mother, my grandmother, my great grandmother. They knew each other when they lived in Italy. So when they came here, when my grandmother came here, my mother's family was already here. My grandmother came probably around 1912. She was about 11 or 12 years old when she came. Her sisters lived here. She had two sisters that lived here. And from what my father tells me, she lived with her one sister. And I guess she was very bossy, and my grandmother didn't like that. So she wound up living with my great grandmother. That was the Luzzies, Daniel and Anthony's mother. She actually lived with them, and when my grandmother and grandfather were married, they had their wedding right in their house. So the families were close. So here you have a Girardi living with two people that are working with the mayor. So, and they're saying that it was politically motivated. So that's when I started to read about Mayor Hague. I read so much about him, I was getting a headache, and I was starting to dislike a man that I never met. Um, I really feel sorry for the people that had to live through those years with him being mayor. I'm sure he helped out a lot of people, but it was like they were under his rule there. I can't imagine. I can't imagine. And today, I don't think anybody would ever get away with what he did. um, and unfortunately, my grandfather worked. He worked on Roosevelt Stadium. So he was part of that, part of his little rule where if you were given a job, then you had to give the 2% back to the mayor, that kind of deal. And it was sad. He made millions off of all the hardworking people in the city. But anyway, so I started to read about him. There was some video clips, and there's a lot of writings about him. I mean, it's an amazing story. If you're interested, it's a good idea to pick up some, there's a lot of stuff on the internet that you can sit and read about him. It was amazing how he rose up, through the ranks and became what he became. But like I said, if it was nowadays, he would have definitely been in jail. When he died, his estate was estimated at about $10 million. His pay wasn't even $10,000 a year as a mayor. So where all that money came from, God only knows. But anyway, so I started doing research, and like I said, for the first year, it was just a lot of reading, and there was so many times I put the stuff down and thought, you know what, I think this is a dead end. But then just something kept tugging at me and saying, you know what, you need to get back and start reading again. And then I would find something that was pretty interesting, and I thought, okay, this is what I found, let me keep looking. And it's continued on like that for the past 3 years. Like I said, there was many times where I didn't think, I was on the right track. But there was 3 things that stuck out to me that made me realize that I needed to do a lot more searching on this guy. The first thing was the investigation itself. When they first started, when the baby was first kidnapped, he was quick to have one of his inspectors go down there and help them out. That was Harry Walsh. I thought it was kind of funny. A city that was pretty far away from Hopewell. I mean, that's probably today, probably about 45-minute drive from Jersey City there. Probably close to 2-hour drive away. So why would you send, one of your detectives down there to investigate? I don't know how they operated back then, but, there wasn't as many people around as there is today, where you need a big police presence on it. But anyway, he sent Harry Walsh down there to investigate, which, you know, that in itself, all right, so he did. You know, maybe they called and asked for help and he sent them down. Okay, but then the second thing that I came across that was kind of, and this was well after reading, you know, this was after a while. Actually, the trial itself, I never believed that Hauptmann was actually the sole kidnapper. Either, I don't know, either he was set up or if he did do it, he didn't do it alone. But anyway, so I really never got into the trial because I listening to clips of the trial, and it was just ridiculous the way they actually the whole thing went about. And today, you know, today a trial wouldn't have been like that. But the second thing that I thought was kind of funny was the prosecutor that prosecuted Hauptmann. Okay, this was a lawyer from South Jersey. Um, he wasn't that experienced as a lawyer. He didn't have any murder experience whatsoever, and yet they wanted him to be able to try this case. Um, so the only way is if he was made Attorney General. With that status, he could try the case. Well, I knew that in the beginning, reading, you know, but it wasn't for a while when I realized, and I came across the writing, that it was now Harry Moore, A. Harry Moore, or Harry Moore. I know him as A. Harry Moore. He was born and raised in Jersey City, and at the time of the kidnapping, he was our governor. He was very good friends with Frank Hague. They were very good friends. In fact, Hague, because of Hague's backing, he was made governor. It was Frank Hague that had Harry Moore make him Attorney General to prosecute Hauptmann, so he could prosecute him. Now, first he has his police investigator going down there. Now he has someone appointed so he can prosecute the case. It just seemed funny that he was really getting deep into this, you know, very much involved in it, when it didn't happen in his own city. More reading shows that the prosecutor, David Wenzel, whatever, however you pronounce his name, he was part of the Democratic Party for South Jersey. At that time, Hague was heavily involved with the Democratic Party for New Jersey. So they had to know each other. They had to have some type of friendship. And it was of Hague's urging to Harry Moore to have him made Attorney General. So that was, you know, reading that, and I thought to myself, okay, well, here's Hague again. He's popping up. The more I read on different things, Hague's name would pop up. If you look back, Harry Walsh, in later years, is made police chief. Was he made police chief because of his loyalty to the investigation and to Hague? Was he rewarded for that? You know, I'm sure that by having him down there questioning people, he could report back to Hague with, you know, how far along they are in their investigation on the kidnapping. But even at that point, I think to myself, okay, well, you know, maybe it's just a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences, but I thought maybe it was a coincidence. What else could you call it? Now, the thing is, before that baby was kidnapped, there was a threat against the grandfather's daughter, the baby's aunt, Constance Morrow, in 1929. Someone threatened to kidnap her. They didn't go through with it. The ransom amount was the same as baby Charles, $50,000. They threatened to kidnap her while she was at school. And the funny thing about that was, there was something that I had read that mentioned the fact that everyone was out of the country at that time when that kidnapping threat occurred. I believe that they were down in, okay, you have to excuse me for a second. I'm thinking, I don't have the paperwork in front of me. But it was mentioned that they thought maybe Anne and Charles Lindbergh were getting married at that time. For some reason, it just seemed odd that this happened when it did, because no one ever went for the money. They had somebody hide out, watch the area for the pickup of the money. Nobody even showed up. So it was more like a hoax than an actual attempt on kidnapping her. And the funny thing is, that was in, I believe it was April of 1929, somewhere around there. Anne and Charles Lindbergh, Anne Morrow and Charles Lindbergh were married a short time after that. There's something, and then I thought, well, maybe whoever did this, it's the same person as the person that took the baby, Charles Lindbergh. But, that was like a thought, a possibility that could have, it could have been the same person. The amounts are the same. It seemed like, now, at that time, it was a short time after that, then Anna and Charles Lindbergh had gotten married. And there was talk. Now, Dwight Morrow then was appointed in the early 30s to the Senate seat. Walter Edge, he was a senator. He was stepping down to become governor of New Jersey, and Morrow took his place in the Senate. Then the election came, and Morrow won the election. He was elected in as senator. He ran against, there was a couple of people he ran against. One of the men that he ran against, because I think there was a woman, either one or two women, that also ran. The one guy, off the top of my head, I can't remember what his name was, but he ran against him, and he won by a landslide. That guy was backed by Frank Hague. So there you go. There's Frank Hague's name again. It comes up that he backed him. So then I started reading deeper into facts about Morrow. In 1917, Morrow was appointed to be like a chairman of the prison board. They wanted, there was a group of them, 5 or 6 of them that were appointed, and their job was to go around to all the prisons throughout the state of New Jersey, the state prisons, and then your municipal prisons, the municipal jails, and any prison system that within the state of New Jersey. Now, that was in 1917. That was the first year that Hague was in office as mayor. Now, I have the report that I downloaded from the internet, the full report from Morrow on his findings. Jersey City was one of the ones that was knocked down. Um, in his report, he noted that it was so badly, it needed to be knocked down and a new one built. There was no um, fixing it. It was so bad, filthy, and just unacceptable as far as, you know. So my feeling there is that way back in 1917, Hague had to have dealings with Morrow. He was the mayor of Jersey City, and the Jersey City jail was one of the out of all of the systems that Morrow had checked, you know, um, Jersey City was one of the worst. So I'm sure that, you know, Hague dealt um, with Morrow way back then. So, and plus Morrow was the richest man in the state of New Jersey. So I'm sure that Hague was well aware of who he was. Um, then he had, you know, like I said, in the election, Hague backed the guy that ran against him. Um, and Morrow won by so many more votes, you know, it wasn't a close race at all. Um, but even at that point, I thought to myself, well, that, you know, okay, even if there was bad blood between the two of them, is that still enough to kidnap a child? I mean, you know, you would seem to think no, that wouldn't be. Um, but then there's always, you know, there could have always been other things that isn't in writing that nobody knew about, um, that could have happened, an incident that happened. Um, you know, Dwight Morrow worked for J.P. Morgan. He was, you know, well, the company, they financed all the railroads. Hague, in his day, um, gave the railroad a really hard time with the taxes. I mean, he jacked up their taxes like 3 times the amount. Um, J.P. Morgan financed a lot of buildings that were in Jersey City. So I don't know if there was more contact between these two men than what you can read about. But, you know, now he wins the election for senator. There was talk that he probably would have been a candidate for the presidency in 32, a very good chance. And now with him and Lindbergh, you know, Lindbergh being his son-in-law, there was talk of the possibility of both of them, president and vice president. Um, People loved Lindbergh after his flight. You know, people loved him. So if he ran for any type of office, he would have definitely got in. Dwight Morrow was a very well-liked man, um, very smart, and chances are, if they ran, they would have won. Um, could they have been that big of a threat to Hague to to do something so terrible to the family? Was that a way to be sure that they would just stay out of the way? I mean, although that you know, Morrow wasn't given that chance, he winds up dying in October 31 um, from a cerebral hemorrhage. So he didn't even get a chance to, you know, we don't know at this point if he would have ever ran, but the probability of it was pretty good. You know, it seemed that he was headed into a political career. Um, And if he ran, I believe that he would have won. Now the thing is, with the kidnapping, when they investigated, when Harry Walsh was down at the Morrow household, um, Violet Sharp, the one servant, um, she winds up committed suicide. She drank silver polish and committed suicide. She was the one that Harry Walsh kept questioning, and a lot of people were up in arms because they said that he was very rough with her, that his roughness, or however they put it, that caused her to basically have like a nervous breakdown and commit suicide, that the harsh questioning pushed her to the brink of her suicide. The thing is, though, I mean, they said she had this silver polish in her closet from her last employer. Why would you? I don't know if you would bring silver polish with you. But anyway, and the funny thing is, I mean, did she know that by drinking it, she would have committed suicide? I mean, that's, to me, that's a little funny. But what I'm trying to get at is that the silver polish, it has the potassium nitrate or whatever you call it, which basically, it attacks all the nerves and muscles, and you stop breathing. And given in small doses over time would cause a cerebral hemorrhage. So I'm wondering at this point, was Dwight Morrow actually, did he actually die from natural causes? He was fairly young, or was he murdered in his own home? And the more you do, you read into it, Governor Hoffman, he wound up dead, committed suicide in his hotel room. Edward Edwards, who was once our governor, backed by Hague, from Jersey City, born and raised. He lived on Pine Street. In fact, during our tour, his house still stands, the same as it was. It's boarded up. There's nobody in it. That house hasn't been touched for years and years. He was found to shoot himself in the head, also committed suicide. That's two. Ellis Parker winds up dead in jail because Ellis Parker, I believe, knew the truth right from the beginning as to who was involved in this kidnapping. He winds up dead. A lot of people wind up dead in this whole thing. Dwight Morrow, I believe, was poisoned. Poisoning was a big popular thing back in the 30s. It was either shooting yourself and making it look like a suicide, or people poisoned each other. And it was very hard. The poisoning was hard to tell because they didn't do the testing that they do today, so you could very easily get away with it. But that's just my opinion. But Hague, as I was doing more reading and reading, Hague's, his name comes up more and more. The jurors. Okay, going through the list of jurors, I didn't go into great detail on that part of it, but I did have a list of the jurors' names, and one by one I searched them. A few of them come out of Jersey City. There was one that was a fire chief or fire captain. He was on the fire department in Jersey City. He was one of the jurors. Now, back then the names were very common. We lived in an area where mostly Irish. Is it a coincidence that these people came up, and any that came back to Jersey City came back to being either a police officer or a fireman? Is that a coincidence? I don't think so, honestly. At this point, I didn't believe it was a coincidence. Um, how they did their jury um, pick back then, I don't know. It's not like today where, as long as you have a driver's license, you could be picked for a jury, for jury duty. How they did it back then, I don't know. Um, but there are ones that come back to Jersey City, which is funny. The next things that I searched were the people that worked in the Morrow household. Now, I went through the Lindbergh family. They were newly married. They only had a couple of people that worked for them. Um, Betty Gow, of course, in the beginning, she was the baby's nursemaid. There was suspicion surrounding her. Um, I think she got sucked in for information. I really don't believe that she was part of the kidnapping plan. Um, in the very beginning, I didn't want to look at any pictures. Because of my dream, I didn't want to um, change the vision of the woman in my dream. But now, 3 years into the research, I have sat down and looked at a lot of the pictures. The woman in my dream could not have been Betty Gow. The woman was taller. It was not too long ago, I did see the video of her pushing the baby carriage when the press got pictures of her. I don't know if she was up in Maine with the baby at the time. It was only the summer right before the kidnapping, so he was pretty much the age, close to the age of when he was kidnapped. And I stopped the video and just looked at her. The height of her is shorter than the woman that was in my dream. Her hair is much, much shorter than the woman in the dream. Even if it was a couple of months, it still wouldn't have been. The woman didn't have long hair, but Betty's hair is kind of cut like a graduated bob, I guess you would call it, where the back is really short. Um, for the way this woman's hair was, is definitely not Betty Gow. She might have been involved. I mean, she was with Red Jantzen. Red Jantzen, in my opinion, was a very shady character. Why they didn't question him more, I don't know. But it's funny that he was scooped up by Jersey City police and questioned, and then he was handed over to immigration from there. Now, if you're familiar with the the story about him, he was a sailor and he jumped ship in New York and he wound up staying here. Um, who knows, who his friends were, but he started to work for McKnight on as a, I guess, boat hand. I don't know what you call them. Took care of his boat and stuff. He worked for him. He worked for the partner from JP Morgan. And that part of it is interesting because him and Morrow were good friends. They vacationed together. Their friends were, their families were friends, their kids were friends. And here Red Jantzen appears to be working on his boat. Now, was he placed in that position to keep an eye on the Morrows during the summer months when, they were up in Maine or wherever they were? It just seemed odd that he approached Betty Gow, when he was working there and she was up in Maine with the baby. He approached her and um, struck up a conversation. They started dating, and um, so you wonder, was he placed there purposely? Could be, could very well be. Um, Now, switching back to Frank Hague was known to have people spied on. Um, his Zeppelins took care of that. He had that elite group of police officers that used to spy on people for him and report back to him. Okay, he was known for that. Now, Enrico Girardi was known to live in about three different locations. Inglewood was one of them, close to the Lindberghs. Was he sent there to spy on them? It seemed like he was following them around. This was something that Frank Hague did too. He would spy on people. He would have them followed. Um, Unfortunately, through my research and, talking with my dad and getting as much information as I could, it turns out that my Uncle Zepp, I had an Uncle Zepp, that was Uncle Anthony Luzzy, they called him Uncle Zepp. So my guess is that he was definitely a Zeppelin for Mayor Hague. These were the guys that would break your legs if you did something wrong, unfortunately. Um, but this was something that Hague did. He had people followed. Um, okay. So now I start talking about Hague. I get a little, if you could hear it in my voice. I mean, all the stuff that I've read about this man, I don't like him. I'm glad I didn't grow up in his era. He should have rotted in jail. Okay, his family's living probably still on his money. Shame on all of them, and that's my personal feeling. Um, that man should have went to jail. He shouldn't have lived the high life that he lived. He stole all the money that he had, and it was a shame. And when I talk about him, I get very upset. So I'm trying to get back on the right track here now. So, he would have people followed. And that's, all right, Enrico Girardi. The three places. So, whoever he was working for had him following the Lindberghs, and that's quite obvious. Back to Red Jantzen. So now they question him. They find a milk bottle in his car. Okay. Some of the ransom bills were passed in Connecticut. His brother lives in Connecticut. But anyway, I think they brought him to Patterson. They had him here. They had him there. They questioned him here. Then he was questioned in Jersey City or Newark, and it didn't matter, those two, because Hague ran Newark also. But then he was handed over to immigration and sent back. But if you look on in the immigration section in Ancestry, it shows a Red Jantzen. I forget how he's listed. I saved the record. He came back here at another time, and it wasn't for the trial. It was like years later. He came back, I guess, to visit. So, was he even really sent back home? That's my question. Maybe they just sent him somewhere to go wherever. But anyway. Okay, so now Jersey City's the last one to question him, and they get rid of him. Okay, so, now I'm reading this and I'm thinking to myself, okay, maybe Hague is involved. I have a feeling that Hague is involved somehow, because Jersey City just keeps entering into the picture here. The next thing I check, was that of when you read the story about them, about like the different things that happened after the baby was kidnapped, the different people that they were in contact with. I mean, the investigation was just crazy. I mean, they wouldn't do an investigation. I work for a police department. I work for the sheriff's department, Passaic County, and I don't think they would ever do an investigation like these knuckleheads did. But that was years ago, and they didn't have the resources, I guess, that they do today. But anyway, um, now you have people popping up all over the place. Oh, I got a call from this one, I got a call from this one. There was one person that was mentioned, and that was Dudley Field Malone. Dudley Field Malone was a lawyer. He resided in New York. From what I read about him, his father was very heavy into the Democratic Party for New York State. Um, he was like the head guy over there, the Tammany Hall or whatever they called it for the Democrats. Their way of their political power was similar to what Hague introduced to Jersey City, but this was in New York, and that was his father. He was a lawyer. He became famous for, it was called a monkey trial or whatever. It was something that he said during the trial that made him famous. I mean, they use it today in lawsuit school to teach them whatever. Um, the funny thing is, years ago when I was young, and even to this day, history and politics are my two least favorite subjects. And look at me today. I'm researching politics and history. So the details, to me, that's not important, what he said in his trial. But anyway, and then later on in years, I mean, from what it said, he was a drinker. Um, he was married 3, 4 times, whatever. And then in later years, he decided to go into the movies. He was in a movie, and I believe that he died. He was living in California, but that was probably in the 40s, early 50s, somewhere around there. But anyway, he called Lindbergh and said that he was in contact. Somebody made contact with him. One of the kidnappers called him and wanted him to be the go-between for the ransom money. I mean, the guy jumped out of the woodwork and wanted to get involved. Now, I know on some of the boards, I mean, through my research, I did go on a lot of the Lindbergh, the kidnapping boards, just to read, because a lot of those people had gone down to the museum in Trenton to see a lot of the evidence. I didn't do that with my research because I'm not really a Lindbergh kidnapping researcher. Like there's tons of them out there, and they do. I guess it starts out as like a hobby and becomes like an obsession. Um, 80 years later, people are still trying to, figure out what happened. Um, I'm coming in on a different angle. It was because of that dream I had, and that was the reason why I started to research the stuff that I did. Um, so detail of the case, a lot of the detail, I don't like with him, with Dudley Field Malone. Um, Now, like I said, his father was heavy into politics. They were Democrats. So you know that Hague and Dudley's father knew each other. They had to know because Frank Hague had a penthouse in New York City. So you know that all the Democrats party together. They're all friends. People on those boards, though, were curious as to who Dudley Field Malone was and, why. Well, reading about him, I mean, you really don't get a detailed, you read, he was married, I think it was 3 times he was married. He has one son. Um, He was in politics too, because he ran for different things. Um, but because, Hague could have been very well been friends with the father, doesn't necessarily mean that he really knows the son. Um, I came across a ship record um, in, I believe, 1929, coming back from France. It's Frank Hague and his wife, Dudley Field Malone and his girlfriend on the same ship. So that tells me they definitely knew each other well. Um, he was the port collector in New York for, 3 or 4 years. And then he got into some type of, I believe he was arrested in Washington for, they were protesting something. Um, but that record of them coming back from France together tells me that they knew each other well. So then I think to myself, well, why did Dudley Field Malone want to get involved in with the go-between? Did Frank Hague ask him to do that, to control the situation a little bit more? I think what happened here was that child was taken because of the political, uh, you know, the political reason. They wanted to make sure that Lindbergh, now they have Morrow out of the way, they want to make sure Lindbergh keeps his distance from politics. And if you snatch his kid, chances are he'll keep his distance. It'll scare him enough to keep him away from it. And I think that was their purpose in taking that child. I don't believe it was for anybody making 50 grand, or then the ransom went up to 70 grand. And I think that they sent like 12 ransom notes. Who does that? If you kidnap a child, 12 ransom notes? Do you really want to get caught? Come on. Um, it just, some of it just don't add up. But anyway, so now Dudley Field Malone is on the ship with Frank Hague and his wife, and that is enough to tell me. Now, Frank Hague, through the years, if you look at his the record, travel, him and his wife go to France and England like it's nothing. I mean, they just hop on the boat. They were stealing everybody's money, and I'm sure the wife had to know what her husband was doing. What the heck? You're stealing all this money from everybody. You might as well go enjoy yourself. And that's exactly what they did. Okay? The funny thing is, though, he liked the Ritz Hotel in France. Dudley Field Malone liked the Ritz Hotel in France. So it's very hard for me to not believe that they weren't friends. So for him to want to get involved in it, it just makes me think that it was probably on the asking, from Frank Hague. Another interesting thing, while I was searching the travel records on Hague and his wife, like I said, there's tons of... She even went away to England without him. I mean, they went every year, a certain time of the year. But there's travel like later on in time where she travels alone or with her son, or then later years they adopted a daughter, Peggy, and she would travel with her. But there's one trip that's pretty interesting. In February of 1932, it's 1 month before the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby, Hague and his wife take a trip to Bermuda. The funny thing about this is the record shows him listed as Rudolph. His name is Frank. He's listed as Rudolph Hague. His wife is named Jenny, and every travel record that you see, she's Jenny. This one says Jane. So they're listed as Jane and Rudolph Hague on a trip to Bermuda. Now, when I first seen that record, I didn't think much of it. I figured they just made a mistake. I mean, I've searched so many records that have mistakes on them that are either people didn't know how to spell or whatever the case may be. But anyway, this particular one to Bermuda, it's the only trip to Bermuda that I see listed for either one of them. So they made one trip. But that was 1 month before the kidnapping. And like I said, in the very beginning, when I first found that, I didn't give it much thought. It wasn't until probably about a year or so later that I was researching on John Milton. John Milton was Hague's personal lawyer and like an accountant because he took care of his affairs. It's written in many, you can find it wherever you read about Frank Hague. With John Milton, what John would do would be to purchase a property for Hague, write out a check, purchase it under his name, and then Hague would reimburse him cash money. That's how he bought his house down in Deal. He owns another house in Florida. Even bank like stocks and stuff. Milton was either, buying this stuff with himself with his own personal check, and then Hague was reimbursing him cash. And then they would put it in some, I don't know what, put it in somebody else's name or whatever. So I did some research on Milton. And if you look into travel records for John Milton, you'll see multiple trips to the Bahamas, okay? The offshore banking down there is popular today. It was popular then too. Anybody that had money was bringing their money down there and placing it in those banks so it wasn't accounted for. I mean, it was an easy way to get rid of money. At first, I didn't think that's what it was, but I did track him going a few times with the same husband and wife that by their location of where they lived and the servants that they had in their home, it was obvious they had some money. Now, why would a married man go on vacation if it was for vacation to go with these people to the Bahamas? Why would you leave your wife home and go with a husband and wife, for a couple of days? And obviously they were going down there to do banking. There were trips Frank Hague's son made to the Bahamas. But once I realized why John Milton was making those trips, then it went back to the record. I went back to the record of Frank Hague and his wife under Jane and Rudolph going to the Bahamas 1 month before the kidnapping. Why was that? Was that to get money? It's funny, in all the records, like I said before, all the records, the travel records for Hague and his wife, they never spelt their name wrong, But this particular record going to the Bahamas, both their names are different. they have the same last name and the same address, where they lived in Jersey City, but the first names are different. And I thought, I could see if they made a mistake on one, but both of them, instead of Jenny, she was Jenny, Jennie, and he was Frank. And here she's listed as Jane, and he's listed as Rudolph. I mean, Rudolph is, Jane could be, all right, Jenny, Jane, maybe. But if your name is Frank, you're not going to make the mistake and write Rudolph. I mean, that's a far stretch from Frank. But anyway, that's the way they were listed. And my feeling, my personal feeling, is that he was, I'm sure he took his wife down to a vacation there while they were there. But I think his main purpose, maybe Milton was unavailable that week. Who knows? But I think the trip was made down there to grab some extra cash. And it just so happens that that trip winds up being a month before the baby was kidnapped.